Hello everyone and welcome back to the HLTCO YouTube channel. Of course, the first two videos that I have recorded for this particular channel have delved deep into the ownerships of both Tottenham Hotspur and Everton Football Club. Today is slightly different because as a Crystal Palace fan, with our game against Brighton and Hove Albion now on the horizon, it is the next league fixture for both clubs at Selhurst Park this weekend. I thought it was a good idea for me to sort of do a one-stop shop explaining exactly why there is such a deep-rooted rivalry between the two football clubs, because from an outsider perspective I know there are plenty of people that don't understand it, that have questioned it, that suggest it's a ridiculous thing that the two clubs hate one another, and it does get quite tedious from both a Palace fan's perspective and I dare say a Brighton's fan's point of view, because we have to constantly explain to people why the two clubs have such a deep-rooted dislike of one another every time the game rolls around. So I sort of thought it was a good idea to come onto YouTube today and explain to everyone exactly why the two football clubs do hate one another and the origins of it. There are plenty of people that think it is purely based on geography and the M23. That is not the case. It's actually a rivalry which dates back to the mid-70s, which I will get onto discussing in very detailed view in a minute. But I often hear people saying it can't be anything like your Arsenal versus Tottenham or your Manchester City versus Manchester United or your Liverpool Everton, because in people's minds that is a derby game. And I think it is pertinent to mention straight off the bat that no Crystal Palace or Brighton fan ever views this particular fixture as a derby game. It is not that. It is a pure rivalry that is based upon, as I say, goings on from the mid-70s which have spilled over ever since. And I think in many ways it actually makes the rivalry more solid for many people, because whether it's your uncle or your dad or your mum who has grown up knowing that Palace don't like Brighton and vice versa, it's something that gets passed down through the generations and has led to us in 2023 having this game at the weekend, where as a Palace fan I am already nervous about it. And it's the weekend and I've got another 7 days to build up to it. That isn't normal. Football fandom, you can only really, for me, sum it up by how you feel as a supporter. And I'm telling you now, as a Crystal Palace fan, this particular fixture, or the two fixtures we play against Brighton in the league every year, mean more at an emotional level than any other. The particular origins of this rivalry actually date back to 1976 and June of that year to be precise. Terry Venables was appointed as Crystal Palace manager at that particular time, and a month later Alan Mullery was given the Brighton and Hove Albion job. And those two instances in isolation may well not mean a great deal to many people, but they were actually the beginnings of the rivalry between Crystal Palace and Brighton and Hove Albion, because of the relationship that those two individuals had when they were in the Spurs side under the legendary manager Bill Nicholson a decade before. The two of them had, I think it's fair to say, a professional rivalry. I don't think it was ever particularly nasty between the two, but Bill Nicholson took the decision back in 1966 to make Alan Mullery the Tottenham captain. He gave Terry Venables the vice-captain's role, and I think there was this sort of vying for his attention as their legendary boss, and both of them wanting to sort of climb the totem pole, which laid the foundations for the rivalry that the two of them were going to have with respective clubs at Crystal Palace and Brighton a decade later. To offer some context for the very beginnings of the rivalry between Palace and Brighton, the 1976-77 season saw both clubs expecting to get out of what was the old third division at that point, a hurdle that they both managed to pass by the time the season had come to a close. But across that particular campaign, the two football clubs would actually go on to meet 5 times, believe it or not, in both League and Cup. And it was the regularity of those fixtures, the fact that both teams were vying for promotion alongside each other, and the unique circumstances of those cup fixtures that was inevitably to lead to the plot thickening, and for the two managers to really start to dig their heels in against one another, and for the fan bases carried away by the emotion of those 5 fixtures to really start ramping up the tension between the two football clubs. The first of the 5 games between the two sides that season saw a 1-1 draw played out at the Goldstone Ground. If you aren't aware of Brighton and Hove Albion's stadium history, they've had a number of stadiums over the last 30 or 40 years. The Goldstone Ground was the precursor to the Whitdean Stadium, which was the ground immediately prior to the Amex where they currently play their football. And that particular game ended in a 1-1 draw. It prompted Alan Mullery, after the game when talking to the press, to say that he felt Crystal Palace were were a very, very good side and that we would be there or thereabouts in the promotion shake-up by the time the season came to a close. So I think immediately battle lines were drawn between the two clubs, and Alan Mullery knew that we were a very worthy opponent and one that they were going to have real trouble with if they were going to shake us off in the battle to be promoted from the third division. The second game between the two sides that season also came at the Goldstone ground, ended up in a 2-2 draw in the FA Cup, and it's a fixture that is memorable from a Crystal Palace perspective, not just because we managed to get the 2-2 draw, but because Rashid Harkouk came off the bench to score the leveller, dribbling past two men before putting the ball in the back of the net, and it was actually his first game for the football club. He actually arrived at Crystal Palace and was immediately banned for 2 months because he had been sent off twice in a non-league game for his former club Pinner Gas. So he immediately became something of a cult hero, as I say, coming off the bench to grab the equaliser and take the game back to Selhurst Park for the replay. And the overall performance from Crystal Palace that day prompted Alan Mullery to be in something of a rage, saying that we had come for the draw, that we had got that, and he dared us to do the same in the replay at Selhurst Park. Obviously he was frustrated by the manner of our football on that particular afternoon and the fact that Brighton hadn't been able to get over the line, but I think it was quite clear at that stage that we were starting to get under Alan Mullery's skin, and it set up what was to come in the remaining 3 fixtures of that particular season. Somewhat inevitably, after daring Crystal Palace to go and play for the draw once again, that's exactly what happened in the replay at Selhurst Park. The game was drawn once more, and because of the nature of the FA Cup at that time and the fact that these things used to happen, there was a second replay that was scheduled rather than it just being played through extra time and penalties to arrange a winner. That particular replay was scheduled for December the 6th at Stamford Bridge, and it was a fixture that was postponed twice due to bad weather. And I think the war of words between the two football clubs, between Terry Venables and Alan Mullery, and the tensions that had risen with Alan Mullery having dared our Palace squad to go and play for the draw once again, plus the postponed fixtures and the length of time that we had to wait until it was actually played, really did set the tone for the game that was to come at Stamford Bridge and all the goings on within it, which I will get onto in a minute, but it really did ramp it up once more and force Alan Mullery into a situation where he completely lost his head from a mentality perspective. The game at Stamford Bridge has gone down in folklore really for both sets of supporters because of the goings on across the fixture. It actually saw Crystal Palace take the lead in the 18th minute thanks to a goal from Paul Holder. Brighton were left aggrieved 10 minutes later when Peter Ward thought he had equalised for Alan Mullery's side, only to have the goal ruled out for handball. Following the game, Jim Cannon, the Crystal Palace defender, actually admitted that he had pushed Peter Ward into the ball, prompting him to handball it, but obviously at the time the decision was made by the referee and his assistants to actually rule the goal out, which really did put the cat amongst the pigeons from a Brighton perspective, because it left them with this sense of indignation, an injustice from the officiating team. Of course, it's impossible to pinpoint at exactly what point the true rivalry between these two football clubs was born, but I think if you were to try and nail it down to a single incident, the 78th minute of that game at Stamford Bridge is probably the place you would go to. There was a penalty given to Brighton and Hove Albion which would have seen them level the scores had they converted it. Brian Horton did exactly that for Brighton, only for the referee to decide that there had been encroachment into the penalty area during the penalty itself. After the game, Alan Mullery was very, very angry because he felt as though the only encroachment had come from Palace's defenders, therefore there was no advantage to be had from a Brighton perspective. But either way, the referee ordered a retake of that penalty. The resulting retake was saved by the Palace goalkeeper, and Palace ended up holding on for a 1-0 victory in that second replay at Stamford Bridge, seeing us go through in the FA Cup and seeing Alan Mullery completely lose his cool at full time, to a point where police had to get involved. By the time the final whistle sounded, I think it's fair to say that Alan Mullery was absolutely steaming with anger, and he marched onto the pitch to confront the referee and his assistants about the encroachment or lack of during that penalty shout for Brighton. Obviously he was given short shrift by the referee and he stomped back towards the tunnel, at which point he was met by abuse from Crystal Palace fans. I think one particular fan threw a cup of coffee over his head, and he actually took change out of his pocket, threw it on the floor and shouted, "That's all you're worth, Palace," at the fans who were goading him just above. He was then led up by police towards the tunnel and was actually fined £100 for bringing the game into disrepute, whilst also flicking a V at the Palace supporters, who obviously took great joy in seeing Alan Mullery so wound up by this victory on a neutral venue at Stamford Bridge in the FA Cup. The fifth and final meeting between the two sides that season came in March of 1977, with that man Rashid Harkouk once again grabbing a couple of goals in a 3-1 victory for Crystal Palace, which really did put the gloss on things for Terry Venables and his players. Of course, both sides actually did manage to make it up out of the third division that season, neither one of them winning the title. I think that particular honour went to Mansfield Town, but it was the foundation of the rivalry that now exists between the two clubs, because even though both teams got promoted at the same time, the fact that there were these 5 fixtures between them and there had been so much bad blood, not just between the players on the pitch, but with the managers taking it into their comments to the press because of the issue with the police, the cup of coffee, the change, the encroachment with the penalty, the FA Cup double replay, it all just came into a big melting pot and led both sets of supporters and players to really feel as though there was a sense of dislike that was mutual on both sides of the divide. After the clubs were promoted in second and third from the old third division, there was a season of consolidation in the second division in 77-78, but in the 78-79 season, both clubs were once again vying for promotion to the first division alongside one another. In that particular season, Brighton's budget massively dwarfed Crystal Palace's, and yet it was Crystal Palace that ended up pipping the Seagulls to the title on the final day. The Seagulls, by the way, was a nickname that Brighton coined themselves. They had previously been called the Dolphins, but I think in the summer of 1977 they changed from the Dolphins to the Seagulls as a direct avian comparison to Crystal Palace, who of course were known as the Eagles, and that shows, I suppose, just how deeply they cared about us and how much we got under their skin. But either way, to go back to that 1978-79 campaign, it was a game against Burnley that Crystal Palace sealed the title with, pipping Brighton to that title by a single point. The fixture against Burnley had been postponed from earlier in the season. It took place after, I believe, the league season had come to a close, and it saw Crystal Palace win in front of a crowd of over 51,000, which remains our record attendance to this day and probably won't be broken. Of course, both sides ended up getting promoted to the first division, but once again there was this real rat-a-tat situation where both clubs were vying for promotion at the same time, and not only did we manage to get promoted, but we managed to pip them to the title at the very last. And I think it just was the latest chapter in this real rivalry that was starting to grow between the two clubs, where we were, beating the same teams week after week, expecting to be above one another, and it had been put in place by those 5 fixtures 2 years before, but the rivalry on pitch was as fierce as you could possibly get when you look at it in isolation. And I suppose this is pretty much where we come to the crux of it, because you will get people who aren't Crystal Palace or Brighton fans that haven't taken the time to research it or to have an open mind as to why the two clubs might have such a deep dislike of one another. Of course it isn't a geographical thing. From Brighton's fans' point of view, I suppose you could say that as the crow flies, Crystal Palace are one of the geographically closest. But from a Palace point of view, we've got the likes of Millwall and Charlton on our doorstep. We have local rivalries, but this one in particular is undeniably born out of actual reasons. The fans that lived through those games in the mid-70s carried that rivalry on into the 80s, and it just became a part of the fabric of both of those football clubs, and it has been passed down through the generations. There are numerous Crystal Palace fans or Brighton fans in 2023 that don't really understand the true reasons why they hate Brighton, but the people that have taken them to those respective football clubs as children have told them of why, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So as much as it can be laughed off, or people can sort of point fingers and say you don't truly care about each other, we do. I'm not gonna build it up to be something it's not. I'm a 34-year-old man. I wasn't around in the mid-70s. I wasn't even born until 1989. And yet, when we play Brighton, whether it is in the playoff semi-finals, where of course, we had a renewal of those rivalries at that particular point in our respective histories. In 2013, Brighton were the club with the new stadium, with the upward mobility. They had the likes of Gus Poyet in, the managerial role, and they really were a club that seemed to be primed for the Premier League. We had taken their star striker, or one of their star strikers, Glenn Murray, on a free transfer. He actually went on to score 30 goals in that particular campaign where we finished in the playoff places. He did his ACL in the first leg of the playoff semi-final at Selhurst Park, a game that ended in a 0-0 draw, and we went into the game at the Amex being written off really as complete outsiders without our 30-goal top scorer on, foreign turf and expecting to just get handily beaten. But instead, there was a very much stoic performance from everyone who stepped across the white line for Crystal Palace that day. And of course, Wilfried Zaha came up with the goods, scoring twice to fire us to Wembley in front of our own fans. And, even though you can go towards the playoff final of that year against Watford that saw us triumphant and get into the Premier League where we remain to this day, I think most Crystal Palace fans, when they think about it from an emotional perspective, have far more tied up in that away victory against Brighton, the 2-0 scoreline with Wilfried Zaha bagging a brace, because of what it meant to the fan base. And this is why I always scoff at those that sort of write it off and say it doesn't matter. I can speak from personal experience. I care deeply about Crystal Palace and have done for as long as I can remember. And believe me, that victory over Brighton, any victory you get over Brighton, just means that little bit more than any other league victory. And that is, always going to be the case, because it is so deep rooted within me now, and it's so deep rooted within every Crystal Palace and Brighton's fans' psyches. And that is why, leading up to this particular fixture this weekend, I felt it was necessary for me to come onto YouTube and explain exactly why the rivalry has its foundations in the mid-70s, rather than it just being a geographical thing that people like to make it out as. I also just want to point out at this particular point, before I sign off for the video, that this isn't the only instance of two football clubs that don't have geographical rivalries hating one another. You can point towards the title battles between Arsenal and Manchester United when Arsene Wenger and Alex Ferguson were in charge of those respective football clubs. You can look towards Liverpool and Chelsea when Jose Mourinho first arrived at Stamford Bridge and their European battles that seem to occur every year. Or even, to go back to the 1960s, the rivalry that was stoked up between Leeds United and Chelsea, which still goes on to this day. And the foundations of those rivalries came because there was a frequent flurry of very, very important games for those two fan bases and clubs, vying for honours between the two of them, European games. It all culminates in a reason for those two football clubs to have legitimate beef with one another. And of course, the Leeds versus Chelsea rivalry culminated in that 1970 FA Cup final, which goes down in history as one of the most physically aggressive games in the English football tapestry, I suppose you could say. But the only difference between those rivalries that I've just mentioned and Crystal Palace and Brighton is the relative prestige of the fixtures. No one is going to suggest that from a neutral perspective it's easy to remember the promotion battle in 1976-77, or indeed the battle to get into the First Division in 78-79. Enough time has passed now that the people that were able to pay attention to it are either getting on or gone, and with that in mind, it isn't a part of the national psyche. That said, for the two sets of fans, it meant a great deal, because, and this is something I say on the podcast all the time, it doesn't matter if you support Sutton United or Arsenal. You care just as deeply about your football club. You follow those clubs up and down the country, and you live and breathe the results that you get week after week. So from a Crystal Palace or a Brighton fan's perspective, if they lived through those games in the mid-70s, they will have felt it just as keenly as anyone else would if it was a fashionable rivalry, shall we say. And that gets passed down to your kids, it gets passed down to your nephews or whoever it is you might take to football, and the thing passes on through generations. And it is exactly why there is this sense of trepidation for every fan on both sides of the divide going into this game between Crystal Palace and Brighton this weekend at Selhurst Park. Hopefully I have done a relatively good job there of rounding up and explaining the foundations of the rivalry between the two teams. I dare say there will still be plenty of people that laugh it off and suggest that it's just a fabrication, but it does get on my nerves to a huge level really when it gets called a derby by Sky Sports, when it gets written off as El Gatwico or the M23 derby, because it's got nothing to do with proximity to one another. It has genuine foundations in the personalities of those two managers in the 1970s, and it has carried on with that as the foundation ever since. And that will be the case for as long as I can see going forward, because at this stage it has become part of the tapestry of the two teams. It doesn't matter that your 18 or 19-year-old that goes to their first Palace v Brighton game has no recollection of Alan Mullery or Terry Venables. It's about what it means to those around them. And having been to numerous Palace v Brighton games, both at home and at the Amex, I can tell you 100% that the feeling and emotion around those fixtures is just different to a run-of-the-mill league game. And unless you've experienced it yourself, you can't say that for sure. And that's, I think, my main reason and gripe for having such a desire to record this video, is that so many people will just laugh it off without even bothering to try and understand the reasons for it. So hopefully I've done a relatively good job of that today. If you liked what you've seen, click on some other videos. Definitely do like and subscribe to this channel. It is still in its infancy, this channel. It's only a month or so old, and I'm trying to build it as organically and quickly as possible. With that in mind, I also record 2 daily podcasts, Monday to Friday, across over on Patreon. One is on Crystal Palace specifically, and one is on football generally. They are £2.50 for the month each, or £4.50 or £4 I think it is now, for both tiers at the same time, which entitles you to 10 episodes every single week. So if you do want to hear more from me and you want to help me to continue to do this for a living, then please do consider jumping off on the Patreon. If not, then please do, just as I say, give this video a like and click that subscribe button, because it does make a massive difference to helping me push this YouTube channel further and further up the algorithm. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to speaking to you again next time.